Hi guys, this is going to be a bit of an unusual video, and I'm partly doing it at the behest of my subscriber BugsMr 123, quoting him. When your head does clear, I'd love to get your impression of what the world is like today for educated, articulate people with details, not whining, just the unvarnished reality of it. Unquote. And actually, this is something that, given my current circumstances, I've thought a lot about. So it's not necessarily directly related to, well, men going their own way or men's issues, although, of course, unemployment is a serious male issue, much more so than it is for females. But generally speaking, what I wanted to address in this video, what I've had in my head for quite some time, and I do apologize if this deviation from my standard topics is off-putting, but I feel it needs to be done, in particular because a subscriber asked me to, or requested that I do so. And I don't need my head to be clear to talk about this, since these thoughts permeate my head almost every day. Well, BugsMr 123, and to anyone else who might have interest, the world is very different to what the world was even 20 years ago. And I am going to go through a little bit of, I suppose, academic and, well, employment CV background for myself. So I was an undergraduate in the 90s, more or less, in the mid to late 90s. And I think what happened was the world around us was going through an incredibly transformative phase, a phase where the face of the world as we knew it was being changed. And what was it being changed by? The internet, of course, the various forms of software coming out, just IT in general. And it was the age of information technology. At the same time, at the same time, our academic advisors, our parents, the so-called mentors that we were to look up to, were not picking up on these details. They were effectively living in the past. I have had a lot of professors that I was very fond of that retrospectively were giving me very poor advice. Now, when I first started as an undergraduate, I very much wanted to get involved in academia. I very much wanted to become a historian of all things. And to that end, I started with history. Shortly, and I switched because I discovered I had a knack for languages. So I pursued German and classics, that is, ancient Latin and ancient Greek and Latin. Of course, you don't need to castigate me for that. I know the error of my ways now, but at the time, effectively, people were in the mid and late 90s. The academic advisors, the mentors, they were still giving you advice along the lines of, study what you want, what you enjoy, do well, and there will be jobs out there for you. The people are, for example, people are looking for articulate, competent students of the humanities. I mean, these were the kinds of things that we heard at the time, and it was unfortunately deceptive. And I do not attribute malice or ill ill intent to the people. I think they were just folks of a bygone generation. Effectively, they missed the train because the train, they didn't need to get on the train. They were at the time in their 50s and their 60s, even in their 70s in some cases. So they had all the requisite skills and abilities they needed to continue to do what they did at the time. Whereas my generation, and I now find myself in my mid 30s, approaching 40s, we we were not we were entering into a new epoch, the epoch of information technology. And yes, we did have the tech bubble and what have you, but it was very clear, at least retrospectively, for me and I suppose others, that the information age was here to stay, that this technology was so transformative, so incredible, so powerful that not being part of it would be of great detriment to you. Of course, at the time, and somewhat idealistic young undergraduate, I just thought I'm going to be going to academia and That's the end of it, so none of that really matters. The current incarnation of Stardust is a very different one to the Stardust of the days of yesteryear, as it were. So, yeah, that was, I think, the most critical issue that I wanted to address before talking about some smaller issues. That there was a great transitional phase, and my generation in particular, somehow, a lot of us, not all of us, missed it by essentially studying what we wanted to study with very little pragmatism in mind. It would have been very important, in retrospect, if someone had taken me aside, shaken me on the shoulder, and said, "Look, it's all well and good you find this interesting, but the world is as it is. It's transforming, and by the time you get out of here, these skills are not going to be useful in a market environment." So no one did that, and I think we were still receiving a lot of poor advice from our mentors, professors, parents. And this is not to fault them. I think most of them are decent, good human beings. But the problem was simply that they didn't need to catch the train, and so they weren't paying attention to the train schedule, more or less. So that's that. That's what happened a bit in a nutshell. And moving forward, and I'm very flattered that this you referred to me as articulate, intelligent. I often have doubts about that, at least as regards to intelligence. I often like to tell my friends I'm smart enough to know how fucked up shit is, too dumb to do anything about it. So, and articulate, I have no idea either, but I do my best. But yeah, having been educated has very little meaning in today's context because education can mean 10,000 different things. One interesting thing that I've talked about with some friends of mine is the concept of the Renaissance man. He doesn't really exist anymore because our knowledge has expanded exponentially. So it's not possible to be a Renaissance man. It's not possible to be, say, Leonardo da Vinci, who knew a little bit about everything. I mean, you can, but ultimately it's to your detriment. For example, I originally strove for that ideal, but it certainly wasn't very helpful. So, what is it like? I can tell you, it was a similar situation when I was looking for work in 2009, 2010. It's a grim picture. Unless you have practical, applicable skills in a sector that's in demand, you're not likely. I mean, you eventually will find some kind of work, but you're not likely to find good work. So, just as an example, back in 2009 and 2010, I was living in New York City. I had moved back from the UK because of some family issues, and I was looking for work. And I spent about a little over half a year before I found anything. Sent out perhaps hundreds of applications. Maybe 90% of them received no answer. 5% of them I got rejections, negatives. And I did eventually get a bit of work going, mostly as a foreign language teacher in some private language schools. But the simple it became glaringly apparent to me back then, 2, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that the world was a very different place to what had been the world of the days of yore, what our elders had told us. Um, and certainly these days I'm looking for work as well, and I think it's even more pronounced. So one thing that's quite interesting is that you need an education, i.e., you need degrees, but the degrees are don't really mean anything. What does that mean? Effectively, that means that most employers are not going to take you into consideration without an educational background, without degrees. At the same time, the degrees themselves mean very little. Now, I am far from what I would call an elitist. In fact, I can't stand elitism. And yet, my Master's of Science is, for those in the States who might not know it, but certainly in the UK, most people know Imperial College London. It's generally considered one of the best scientific technical universities in the world, kind of the MIT of Europe. And I don't really give a shit that I went there. The people there were full of themselves and generally unpleasant. But the point is that even degrees like that don't do a whole lot for you uh, in that sense. So anyway, for a while I was very much stuck on continuing the academic career, but then I realized at some point in the mid 2000s that this was a dead end. At the same time, to sustain myself, I was mostly teaching English as a foreign language. It's something, and I can recommend this to other people. It's something that you can do that you will always be able to sustain yourself with. You might have to go abroad, you might have to sacrifice your own culture, but it's something you can do to sustain yourself with. And I know a lot of people my age, younger, a bit older, articulate, educated, smart. That's what they do for a living, simply because whilst they're articulate, intelligent, and educated, they're not masters of IT. They're, for example, I came late to the whole IT game. My father was I mean, he's basically a good person, but was an incredible Luddite. He did not like technology, and he's quite old as well. And yeah, he had his reasons. There weren't good reasons, but he had his reasons. Being a Luddite, I was not exposed to very much technology when I was younger. In some ways, when I was growing up, the world resembled the 50s more than anything else in some regards. And because of that, I didn't get access to computers until I was, in my late teens, early 20s. A lot of the IT stuff I've had to learn since has come much later. So, and it's just been in doses. So it's not the skills I have acquired, self-taught mostly, are not the kinds of skills that are sufficient to advertise myself at least directly in that kind of field. So say take HTML. HTML. I know some HTML, but I had to teach it to myself. I'm far from master, and I'm really rusty with it because I haven't touched it in a long time. The same goes for Adobe software. Well, of course, Dreamweaver. That's what you work with, HTML. Programming, I've actually never been exposed to. Of course, as a translator, I had to learn a lot of translation software. Those are some of my new CAT tools, computer-assisted translation, things like that. But I was a latecomer to all of that, and so that took a long time to sort of acquire these kinds of skills, and it's just not enough. So essentially, I'm in the same spot that many people of a similar background are in, which is namely, well, educated, whatever that means, somewhat articulate, somewhat intelligent, but we don't have a whole lot of skills to offer. The skills I have to offer are the skills of translation, which I'm applying for jobs in that area. I've been applying for things as a foreign language correspondent. I have one law firm that may be getting back to me next week on that. Teaching English, well, also German and other languages, a foreign language. Well, of course, teaching German here is a moot point in Germany, but certainly teaching English as a foreign language. And those aren't a wide variety of skills. So, in terms of practical skills, by the time I became aware of the mistakes I had made, and I would like to also say, I'm not blaming anyone, but disinformation that was offered to my generation in the 90s, you know, it's a bit too late. The ship has sailed for me. I don't have the time to catch up on all the technology that would make me competitive in areas where that's relevant, and my educational background is not in that either. So I've made my peace with that. That said, I'm looking in areas that are relevant, and I mentioned this in the previous video that I may or may not end up going abroad, possibly to the Middle East, for example, for simply because the cash there is good and because I have a lot greater probability of finding work there in the so-called TEFL, teaching English as a foreign language sector, which has its pitfalls and bad sides and good sides, but the work there tends to be a lot more secure, especially if you have my background. Well, I've talked a lot, but let me say, one of my subscribers, Max Pound, he sent in one of the comments. I was very encouraged to see that a young guy told me that if it weren't for Barbarossa's videos and my videos, he would have gone down the false path. He was studying fine arts originally, and he switched to, I believe, being a pharmaceutical technician, which of course is a practical avenue and is likely going to land him a pretty decent job. No matter the fields that are practical, relevant to society, and unfortunately, as a former humanities student, I have to say it's not very relevant. People don't care about stuff like that. It's not very productive. It's something you can really do in your spare time. If you want to read books about, I don't know, the fall of Rome, you can do that in your spare time. But I would never, never, never encourage young people to study anything like that. I would never encourage them to study anything in the humanities. If you want to study languages like I did, then I would strongly, strongly urge you to pair it up with something. Maybe something business related, certainly something IT related. I mean, language skills will always be important, but if you don't acquire your language skills in a context, if it's in a vacuum, if you're spending way too much time, looking at reading, I don't know, Goethe and and Rousseau, it doesn't really matter. So that's very important. But I'm very encouraged, and that's not the first message I've gotten. I've gotten a couple of PMs of young people who are, changing their direction based on my experiences. And I think, in regards to that, that's how I look at it. I see my experiences being able to help the next generation, particularly of men, to make wiser decisions in what they're doing. Because for some odd reason, of course, women tend not to be nearly as affected by unemployment as men do. A lot of this is to do with a lot of the jobs, say physical labor jobs, which I do now, are primarily male dominated. But women, as always, I think, I know this is a bit of an abstraction, but I think in general we as a civilization, as a species, we don't like seeing bad things happen to our women folk, and that's part of it, of course. So in some cases, I think people would be more willing to fire a man than a woman just for that reason. But I digress. So that's very encouraging, and I see myself in that regard as being able to pass on important information that's relevant to the younger folk who will be able to save themselves, hopefully, from the predicament I'm in. That doesn't mean that I completely regret my academic career or the things I've studied. Certainly, I've learned a lot, and a lot of it was enjoyable. But retrospectively, I could have I could have made a lot better decisions in many regards. Other options really are just to learn a trade. I mean, there's so many important trades in the world. Uh, I really can't stand the academic world. I don't like the people there. They tend to be arrogant and full of themselves. I mean, and ironically enough, or not ironically enough, Imperial College was the worst of them. Prior to that, I went to the University of York, which was a lot more mild-mannered, and that's in the UK. Anyone in the UK would know it. And as an undergraduate, I went to SUNY Binghamton, New York, and it was a public school, a state university, and I did so to basically save money. One thing I'm fortunate for is that when I was an undergraduate, I was able to work on the side because it was a public university. I didn't incur any debt. For my other two master's degrees, I paid for it all by myself by all the savings I had accrued working in Asia, so don't have any debt there either. So in contrast to a lot of people my age and younger, one thing I'm blessed by is I have no debt. I don't owe anyone money, and I'm quite happy about that. So as soon as I can start earning decent money again, I can start saving again. I don't have to pay anyone any money. But I digressed again. Trade school, I mean, whatever it might be, auto mechanic, carpentry, there's so many things that people need. I mean, retrospectively, becoming a plumber might have not been such a bad idea because, well, everyone needs plumbers. You're probably able to command a pretty decent salary being a plumber. So there's just a lot of things, practical avenues. And the thing is, as well, is that if you pursue that, you'll have gainful employment. And if you are interested in these other topics that are a bit arcane, a bit out there, you can read books about them. The internet is full of information. Um, but ultimately, that is how the world looks. It's a place where pragmatism, more so than I think ever, but I mean, pragmatism has always reigned supreme, but it's more so the case, and that's fine. That's just the way it is. Pragmatism is the primary drive behind every sector in the economy. And it doesn't matter how intelligent, articulate, educated you may or may not be. It doesn't matter unless you can do, well, just as an example, C++ really well, have perfect knowledge of HTML, you know, and so on and so forth. I mean, if you can master things along those lines, or you have training, real education, true education, as a chemical engineer, as a civil engineer, maybe as an applied mathematician. These are the things that are relevant to the world, and these are the things you'll be able to get work with. So intelligence is one thing, but it's not going to get you work. And especially if you do a field that's not very relevant. So I know several people with doctoral degrees that are. I know one guy. Admittedly, he did a PhD in music theory, so one you wouldn't have to. It doesn't surprise anyone that he ended up doing what he's doing now, but does a combination of cleaning toilets and waiting tables to make ends meet. And he finished his PhD 4 years ago. Others, in less acrimonious circumstances, despite that, not doing what they wanted to do with PhDs in linguistics or history or what have you, forget all of that. It's not relevant anymore. It's whether we like it or not, whether individuals like it or not. That's not the world. The world places value on or inserts value into pragmatic endeavors, and that's what I think all of us should focus on. That's also why I decided to spend more or less the last of my savings at Imperial pursuing as pragmatic a degree as I could, which is translation, but also translation technology and software, which you need to know to get into that industry, and that was pretty important. Um, and why we did, I would say, probably even more of the software and stuff than we actually did translation on the course. So that was me being as pragmatic as I could with the last of my money, given my background. Going forward, though, as I said, everyone should be looking towards pragmatic endeavors and trying to align themselves along the lines of what the world wants or expects. Information technology, practical, applicable skills. I'm not particularly bitter. It's just the way it is, and these are the lessons that I have learned. And another thing, another thing that's very interesting, a trend I've seen. I was just looking at some student job websites. It's quite interesting, and you'll see thing. I mean, it's a physical impossibility to have. I mean, you could do a part-time job, of course, as a student, to have had 3 years professional experience, and yet many of these companies are asking for things like that of students, young people, people who are 15, 20 years younger than I am. How are you supposed to have 3 years of professional experience when you've just finished your degree? It's there. So that's a really kooky thing that makes no sense. The other things make sense, but uh, that's just bizarre. Then, of course, you have what they call here in Germany sort of the rotating intern principle. So a lot of young people will go into internships, paid and often these days unpaid, completely unpaid, in the hopes of moving up the hierarchy and moving ahead. What they do what the companies do after the internship is over, 6 months, whatever, they get rid of them and get the next intern. And I think this is common practice everywhere. I mean, but in Germany, of course, they complain about it a lot. That you knowing you can't really get a permanent job, you can't even get a semi-permanent job as a young person, and that's what happens. They're just rotating various interns, and it saves people money. Um, I don't. I'm not going to go into details at where I work, for example. Most people are part-time there, including myself. Why? Saves certain people money. And so that's the nature of the beast. In addition to all of the other stuff that I saw, I think, and I know there are a lot of Austrian economists that are predicting a collapse for a long, long time, and I'm fond of their work, but we don't know when it's going to happen. This could go on for a long, long time to come. I think at least 10 years. There's no recovery in sight. Um, I was talking the other day to a very despondent friend of mine in Greece, as I mentioned, who told me, unemployment for people below the age of 30 is at 50% and perhaps even higher. And that's a grim picture. It's really just coming down to survival. I mean, in a way, even without identifying myself as such, I've always been a bit of a member of MGTOW. I've always been a bit of a survivalist. If I couldn't find work in the past, I usually would just pick up my bags and leave the country. Uh, and so I'm probably going to have to end up doing that again, I imagine, but that's just part of my lifestyle. I am the eternal expat, no pun intended. But for people who want to build a life for themselves, there is no real future in that sense. It's in people who are very skilled in certain things. I'm not talking about useless things. Even things I've mentioned, there can be an oversaturation of that, and then you'll have problems finding work. You can be overqualified in relevant things. So a guy I occasionally game with from Ireland, very, very bright guy who did a PhD in a computer science related topic. You'd think, with his expertise, companies would be, jumping up trying to get him, but they're not. He became perhaps too specialized, and he's overqualified. So that's the world, Mr. Bugs 123. The world, at least as I see it, what the world has become, particularly in the realm of employment and education. It's one that's very volatile, that offers not even the semblance of stability, even though stability has always been a simulation at best. Stability doesn't exist in life. There are always things that get in the way, and things that shock you and knock you down. You have to get back up. But the world of the past, here in Germany, in the UK, really anywhere in the world, barring Asia, which is a big of an exception, which one day I might talk about, the Western world is one that is very unstable, will remain unstable for a very long time, in my assessment, and one that doesn't resemble the world it was even 30 years ago or even 25 years ago. The time when a degree was meaningful. Everyone has a degree now, it's not a big deal. Everyone has a master's degree now, it's not a big deal. Everyone has two master's degrees now, it's not a big deal. Everyone has a PhD, it's not a big deal. So what do you do in a situation like that? And yet all of these things are requirements, more or less, barring the PhD perhaps. That's the world we live in, and it's not one that's going to change anytime soon. Fortunately, for me, I'm a pretty good survivalist. Not in the sense that some people are, like Vention, who I admire a lot. With he's a true survivalist, I suppose. But I'm someone who, if I need to, I can get up and live in the stinking jungle if I have to make ends meet. It's actually never happened, specifically jungle-wise, but you get my point. That said, I'm very happy that the younger generation is catching on. It's very encouraging when I talk to people, especially online gamers, when I hear what they're doing. A lot of applied mathematics, pharmaceutical stuff, computer science, and they do have a lot of debt, which is discouraging. But it's good to see that they're taking a practical path, and they're walking a practical avenue, because that is the future. All of that stuff, if you want to get a job, that's the future. Things say in the United States that are not very pleasant to think about are Social Security. Now, um, I don't pay into Social Security since I don't live in the States, and I'm far too poor. Mind you, by the way, the United States is one of the few countries in the world, it's amusing, if you earn enough money, that you have to pay double tax. That is the tax of the country you're resident in, and the tax for the United States. But things like Social Security, of course, are not going to be there for people who are, say, 22. I mean, it's highly, highly unlikely. I don't even think it's going to be there in large measure for people like myself. And even in Germany, people are aware that the so-called safety net isn't really there anymore. There is no safety net. So we have to look after ourselves, particularly men. Especially men have to look after ourselves. And so that's very encouraging. Guys like Max Pound and others who have dropped the useless and unfortunately these days pointless academic pursuits like fine arts or whatever, and are moving on to more practical endeavors, because that's what you need. And I talk to lots of guys online, and I encourage them whenever we get into conversation. I try not to be pushy, but if we lean towards that direction, I always say pursue something practical. Don't stop the English and writing. You can learn how to read and write on your own. You don't need a background in it. Do something practical. Anyway, I didn't want to ramble too much, but this is something I've had on my mind for quite some time, and I wanted to, of course, accommodate one of my subscribers' requests, and I thought I could add my thoughts on that subject. That's what the world looks like these days. It's very, very different to since you're retired, Mr. Bugs. To assume your world, certainly my parents' world. Even the world of those, say, born in the 60s. It's not the same world. It's very different. It's a much more difficult world, and the only way to survive is to pursue pragmatic endeavors and to be extremely flexible. And by that, for example, I mean in 2 months, if I'm every day I send out, it's to try every day to send out a job application, at least one, nothing pans out, I will be heading eastwards. I can almost guarantee that. Eastwards meaning leaving the Western world. So anyway, I know this is off topic. This is not typical Stardust material, but it is relevant because, let's face it, we all need to make ends meet. We all need to put bread on the table. We all need to survive, and it's very, very important. So anyway, thanks for watching, as always, and I appreciate your comments. And I know I've said this before, but all of my subscribers are very valuable to me in a human sense. I enjoy some of your comments, barring BJ Grimm, who just posts nonsense, although I tolerate him. And I look forward to your comments, and hopefully I'll get some more Stardusky material out there soon enough, with employment or without, one way or another. Thanks, and take care. Best wishes.